are in listen-only mode.
Hi, this is Scott Anthony from Innosight. I'm joined with my colleague David Duncan. We're looking forward to today's webinar. We're going to be starting in just a couple minutes as we allow a few more people to join us. So hang tight. We'll get started in about 2 or 3 minutes or so. For those of you who just joined us, this is Scott Anthony from Innosight. Thank you for joining the Improving Your Innovation Success Rate webinar. We're going to wait just about 60 seconds or so for a couple more late attendees to arrive, and then my colleague David Duncan and I will get started. So hang tight for just a minute or so more. All right, we're going to get started. This is Scott Anthony from Innosight. You can see hopefully my picture on the screen here. I'm joined by my colleague David Duncan. We're going to be with you for about the next hour or so to talk about improving your innovation success rate. So let me just give you 2 pieces of housekeeping before we get into the material for today. First, we have muted everybody's line, so we're not going to have any audio participation beyond you're going to hear me and you're going to hear Dave, but no other voices during the course of this conversation. You're, of course, allowed to talk if you'd like. We just won't hear you. The second thing, we are going to pause a couple times to take questions. So if you have any questions that come up as we go through the webinar, please feel free to key it in through the question box that's on your screen. We'll collate the questions and try to answer a few of the common themes that we see during the natural pauses during the webinar. And anything we don't get a chance to get to during the discussion, we'll make sure to try to answer through our blog or through other means. So again, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. This is Scott Anthony. I'm coming to you from Innosight's Asian headquarters in Singapore. My colleague David Duncan is joining us at the United States. Dave, thanks for joining. It's a little bit later for you. It's 10 a.m. here in Singapore, 10 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States. So let me just tell you briefly about who we are before we dive into some of the materials here. For those of you who don't know Innosight, we were founded by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen back in 2000 with a mission of helping companies achieve significant, repeatable, and sustainable growth. You have 2 of our offices represented here, the United States and Singapore. We also have an office in Switzerland. I'll draw your attention primarily to the right side of the page. There are 3 primary things we help our clients do. The first is we help them chart winning growth strategies in the face of the disruptive changes that are sweeping through their industry. The second, and the focus for the discussion today, is helping organizations build capabilities for repeatable growth through innovation. Finally, we help clients design and launch high-impact new businesses, accelerate the ventures that allow them to deliver against the strategy they set, channeled by the capabilities they create. So why is the problem we're talking about today, improving your innovation success rate, why does that matter? I want to just quickly hit 4 different ways to frame up why this is such an important challenge today. So let me start with the picture on the upper left part of your screen. That's a picture of a guy named Bob Johansen, who is at the Institute for the Future. So his job is to look into the future and try to predict what the world will look like in 10 or 15 years. He's been doing this since 1968, so he has outlived a lot of his forecasts. In his most recent book, Leaders Make the Future, Bob channeled this term from the U.S. military to describe the state of the world today. He said that we live in a world increasingly characterized by these 4 words here. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. And what Bob said is the only thing he can predict is that all of these things are going to increase in the near future. Innovation is incredibly important in the midst of a VUCA world. 75%, the picture on the upper right side of the page. That is the percent of companies on the Standard & Poor's 500 index, the largest, most powerful publicly traded companies on U.S. stock markets, that if current trends hold, will not be on that index in 15 short years. They will stumble. They will be overtaken. They will be acquired. The great companies in 2028 will be companies that might be tiny little entities today, or in fact might not even exist. That's how quickly our world changes today. You might say it's a great time to be a startup then. You have on the bottom right of your page here a picture of Facebook at its initial public offering. Facebook is an exception, 75%. That's the percent of venture-backed startups, the creme de la creme of the startup world, that don't return a cent to their investors, let alone the kind of outsized gains that Facebook has. It is incredibly difficult in today's world, whether you're a big company or you're an upstart. Finally, on the lower left side of the page, you have a picture of my daughter, Holly. This is a Christmas present we bought her a couple years ago, a Dora the Explorer laptop. We got her that present because my wife, who is a very forward thinker, noticed that Holly liked working with me on my laptop. So she said, why don't we get her something that approximates a laptop form factor so that when Holly enters the workforce in 20 years or so, she'll be that much more prepared. True story. My wife is always thinking ahead. 95% are the odds that I put on Holly using a different form of computing than a laptop. I don't know if it's going to be done via glasses, via touch, via brainwaves, or whatever. But the world is changing so quickly today that that which is dominant, that which is things that we use every day, will largely be different, if not insignificant, as we continue to move into the future. This is the basic challenge that we all face inside organizations today, and why innovation is such a critical task. Now, we want to get a sense from you about how satisfied you are with the return on your innovation investment. So I'd like our team to open up the poll here so we can get you to give us your perspective about how well things are going in your organization. So key in your response here, and we'll see what trends we see across the group. All right, let's close the poll and see what kind of responses we got to this question. My team is busy tallying the poll. They're going to tell me via Skype chat as we try and work technologies in 3 different locations here today. They're going to try and tell me what the results are. All right, so 5% of you said that you're extremely satisfied with your return on your innovation investment. So we clearly got a lot of room to improve here. 20% of you say that you're satisfied. So 25% of the group here either gave this a 4 or 5. So we got some people here who are tackling this challenge pretty well. Now you start going to the further answers. You get 40% of you that feel neutral about this. You're neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. You have 28% who are dissatisfied with the return you're getting on your investments. And fortunately, that means only 8% of you are ready to give up. Don't give up. It's a tough challenge, but one that we really think is something that you can overcome. So this is pretty consistent with what we see and what we experience out in the field. There are certainly companies that feel really good with the returns they're getting on innovation. We got 25% here that are pretty satisfied with their returns. But generally speaking, innovation is a challenge inside most organizations. So what do people do in the face of this challenge? Well, companies try lots of different things in order to try to successfully buck these odds and get good returns on their innovation investments. This is one example. This is a company that we met a few years ago that said what they wanted to do was find a way to increase the number of ideas that were being generated inside the organization. So this is about 2009 that they started doing this, and last year I just asked them how it went. So they forwarded to me the employee newsletter that they had sent out that summed up the result of their efforts. You can see a lot of the sparkling, a lot of the excited language that you see in a lot of these corporate sorts of efforts. To light a fire, all you need is a spark. This is what was produced through the Idea Palooza that we held in 2009. We got more than 1,000 ideas from employees that led to 4 internal teams. The kind of excitement and enthusiasm that often gets generated when you have one of these idea generation contests. 18 months later, the newsletter reported the fire still burns. Though we did not directly create the new businesses, the plans helped to inform investments outside of our core business, and so on. Now, if you cut through the corporate speak here, anyone who spent any time in organizations knows that what really happened, unfortunately, was just about nothing. We see this all too frequently. People go and they try well-intentioned efforts to try to improve their ability to create growth through innovation. It might be doing the idea contest that this company did. It might be having a hackathon, bringing in a creativity consultant who dresses in a funny outfit. It might be an open innovation program like Procter Gamble has done with its Connect and Develop program. It might be creating financial incentives for innovation, having external contests, creating something like Lockheed Martin's Skunkworks organization, or a venture investing arm like Intel Capital. Each of these on their own are good. But one of the things that we've observed from our now decades that we spent in the field trying to answer this problem is that they are insufficient. Innovation, particularly inside a large organization, is a system-level problem. And you cannot solve a system-level problem with a point-level solution. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague David Duncan, who's going to talk a little bit about what we think the answer is to this problem, how you can think systematically about solving the challenge of growth and innovation. So Dave, the mic is yours.
Great. Thanks a lot, Scott. Before I get into talking about the system-level solution and how we think about that, I'd just like to refer back to Scott's opening remarks around the accelerating rate of change that we see in the world today. And when you think about this idea that these point solutions are insufficient, insufficient for what? What is the overall objective of innovation for which you need a systems-level solution? And the answer is simply that companies need to evolve or they'll die, and the pressures on them and the rate with which they need to evolve is higher than ever. And in order to do that, they need to essentially establish a portfolio of different types of growth, spending most of their resources and time and attention continuing to extend and strengthen and expand their core businesses while they're simultaneously planting the seeds of new businesses that will be their core businesses of tomorrow. And establishing and managing that portfolio of different types of growth is ultimately what enables you to evolve and to perform for the long term. And as Scott was just describing, point solutions to that fundamental challenge are insufficient. And what we'd like to introduce here is a framework for how we think about what the total set of enablers are that you need to address that challenge. And we found it helpful to introduce this metaphor of a factory or a growth factory to describe what the different components of this system are and how they interrelate. And the way we use that metaphor is, in this case, whereas a conventional factory is designed to, in a predictable, systematic fashion, spin out some sort of widgets, a growth factory is intended to do the same thing, but to do so for new sources of growth, but again in a predictable and systematic fashion. And so I'm just going to click through the 4 foundational components of that growth factory, and then we'll dive in a little bit more detail. The first component is what we call the growth blueprint. And this is essentially your plan for how you're going to grow. So in the factory metaphor, this would be analogous to a plan for what types of things you're going to produce with your factory, in what quantities, and on what timeline. And we're going to go into quite some detail about this. The second component is what we refer to as production systems. So once you have a design in mind for what you want to get out of your factory, you then need some mechanism to actually create and produce that stuff. And so these production systems are analogous to the assembly lines in the factory, only in this case, instead of sourcing raw materials and creating finished goods out of them, you're sourcing ideas, which are the raw materials for innovation, and you're using processes, structures, resources to create new sources of growth. And we'll go into that in some detail as well. Then once you have that, the third component is obviously people. So you need people to operate your production systems. And there's a range of things you need. You need leaders to lead your factory, and then you need people to operate the different types of assembly line equipment that you have in your factory, and the same is true for a growth factory. And then finally, as an overlay to all of that, you need what we refer to as governance and control. So you need ways to assess the productivity of your factory, to rebalance resources across the different types of production systems in your factory, and to assess how effectively it's operating. So that's an overview, and now we'd just like to go into a little bit more detail. And you can see actually why, just by using this framework, it provides some insights into why some of those standalone solutions that Scott was referring to, for example, the idea challenge, don't often have a ton of impact, because an idea challenge is a subset of a production system. It's basically a way of sourcing ideas. And but if you just source a bunch of ideas and you don't think about the other elements of the system, for example, the growth blueprint that would describe what types of ideas are going to be most attractive to you, and therefore on what basis you're going to prioritize ideas, if you don't have the right people in place to then pursue those ideas, that have the right skills, and if you don't have a resource allocation process that can allocate resources to those ideas, then oftentimes those idea challenges end up fizzling out, and they just kind of hit a brick wall because they haven't thought about the other elements of the system. So there's this slide that Scott has just put up on the screen here peels back one layer beneath that high-level framework that I just introduced, and describes some of the most critical elements of the system that need to be in place in each of those 4 categories. There's a lot more detail on this in the ebook that we recently wrote on this topic, and we're going to cover some of this in a little bit more detail shortly. But here I'd just like to emphasize one key feature of a successful growth factory that really cascades through all of these components. And again, it's this notion that in order to sustainably perform for the long term, in order to evolve, you have to consciously manage more than one type of growth or innovation at the same time. And in all 4 of these categories, each of them is characterized by that, is aligned to that goal. So in your growth blueprint, we talk about needing to explicitly define what types of growth you're going to pursue and having distinct goals for each of those types of growth. In the production systems, we talk about needing to have distinct structures and processes for each type of innovation or growth that you're going to pursue across that full life cycle, and customized metrics for each type. Within the governance and controls category, you need to have a kind of system in place that enables you to balance resources across those different types of innovation and growth, which is often something that we see missing in many organizations. And then finally, within the people component, the leadership, talent, and culture, you need to have the right talent allocated to different types of growth, because it often takes very different skills and aptitudes to pursue those core types of growth versus the more transformational types of growth. So I'm going to turn it back over to Scott now to make some of this more concrete with some specific case examples.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dave. I'm just going to add one thing to what Dave just went through before I give you one of the examples that features in our ebook. Just one thing to add to what Dave said. The reason why thinking about these different types of innovations and the challenges related to that is so important is because organizations at their heart are essentially constructed to do one thing, and they have gotten really good over a period of time at doing that thing. They are good at executing today's business, not necessarily discovering tomorrow's business. So once you recognize that an organization that is going to fight against the trends and all the changes taking place in the world today, once you recognize it has to do more than that, that has a lot of knock-on effects for different parts of the organization. And one place where this became really clear to us, and one of the deep case studies that we feature in the Building a Growth Factory ebook, is the work that we did with Procter Gamble during the course of the first decade of the 2000s. Now, most of you, I imagine, have heard of Procter Gamble. Here's just a few of the basic facts about it. About a $200 billion company by market capitalization, serves roughly 4 billion people around the globe on a daily basis with many of its great brands that appear on the bottom of the page. Invests quite significantly in innovation and growth, about $2 billion in research and development, about 9,000 research scientists around the globe, and about $400 million a year in consumer research. So you could look at this as about a $2.5 billion annual investment in innovation. And it's clearly something the company takes very seriously. As current chairman and CEO Bob McDonald rightly notes, we know from our history that while promotions win quarters, innovation is what allows us to win decades. So you've got a company that is clearly focused on innovation, that's in many fast-changing markets, that has top leadership commitment consistently through innovation. But if you go back to 2000, the organization had a problem. The easiest way to frame it up is with the three statistics on the page here. 15%. This is the percent of Procter & Gamble's innovation initiatives that were succeeding, that were delivering against the promises that they made when they decided to invest in the initiative. 85% of them were failing. Even worse, the ones that succeeded were relatively small. That meant that the answer to the question, is our portfolio, is our pipeline sufficient to meet our growth objectives over the course of the next 5, 7, 10, 15 years? The answer to that question was no. Over the course of the next 10 years, P&G had a number of specific interventions to try to address this challenge. First, P&G got very clear about the different types of growth it was going to follow, very consistent with the point that Dave made. So in P&G's world today, it thinks about 4 different types of innovations. Commercial innovations, what ways to drive trial and use the products without changing the product itself, new marketing approaches, new packaging approaches, and so on. Sustaining innovation. This is what Procter & Gamble calls the innovations. They're better, they're faster, they're cheaper. You would call these line extensions or incremental improvements to products. Then there are the transformational efforts. These are efforts to truly step change a category where you introduce a completely new benefit or much better performance than what existed historically, such as when the Gillette brand of razors, which is part of Procter & Gamble, went from 1 blade to 2 blades to 3 blades to 5 blades. Finally, there are disruptive approaches, efforts to create new categories and create new sources of consumption, like Procter & Gamble did with pressed white strips, where it allowed people to whiten teeth in the comfort of their home, or the Swiffer line of products, which allow people to very quickly clean a surface. So define these specific growth types and measure and manage them in different ways. Dramatically increase the raw materials for innovation. P&G did this in 2 ways. First, they instituted the program known as Connect and Develop to tap into the tens of thousands of individual scientists around the globe. At the beginning of the last decade, they set a goal that by the year 2008, at least 50% of P&G's innovation efforts had to have some kind of connection to the outside world, and they exceeded that goal by 2006. They also instituted a program called Consumer is Boss, where everyone at Procter & Gamble would increase the amount of time they spent working alongside consumers, living alongside consumers, shopping with consumers, to try to understand the things those consumers wanted that they could not readily articulate. The third innovation was recognizing that some of these new types of growth required dedicated resources and required a specific process. So you will see within P&G today dedicated teams focusing on the transformational and disruptive ideas, because they have to do things differently if they're going to succeed. Fourth, P&G integrated innovation and strategy. They used to be two different processes within the organization, but today they are thought of two sides of the same coin. Fifth, to some of the things Dave was talking about underlying systems, P&G worked very hard to strengthen its underlying portfolio management and resource allocation systems. Today, at any given time, any of P&G's leaders, at a moment's notice, can get a very quick look at any of the 1,000 or so innovation initiatives that constitute P&G's growth portfolio. They can understand who's working on those ideas. They can understand where they are in the innovation process, what their potential is, what their required investment is, and so on. Just like if you happen to invest in stocks, you can go to your online site and see your stock report. P&G can, without any human intervention at all, get a quick glance at its portfolio, which helps inform discussions about strategy and make sure the right resources are in the right places. Finally, P&G has invested heavily in training programs that can help to build a common language around some of these types of innovation and build new skills as well. Now, these things aren't being done academically. During the course of this time, Procter & Gamble did this work on a number of demonstration projects around the globe, whether it's the Align probiotic solution that was introduced in North America in 2009, or the Gillette Guard razor blade that was introduced in India in 2010, or even new forms of services like Tide Dry Cleaner, a franchise-based business that began appearing in the United States a few years ago. These are all efforts for Procter & Gamble to thoughtfully step away from its traditional business and explore new market spaces and sometimes even new business models. Most importantly, by the end of the decade, those three statistics had all changed in a meaningful way. So if you fast forward to 2010, by this point, about 45% of innovation initiatives were succeeding. Now, this is actually a number that P&G doesn't want to push too much higher, because there is some risk and there is some uncertainty in innovation. And the way that you make your success rate close to 100% is you do very safe, very incremental things. If you've got that portfolio mindset that Dave mentioned, you recognize that sometimes you're going to fail, and that's okay, because the ones that are now making it through the process are much bigger than they were before. They're about twice as big as they were in the earlier part of the decade. So you put these two numbers together, 3 times increase in success rate, 2 times increase in size, you can see that P&G has managed to get about a 6-fold increase in its innovation productivity. And perhaps most importantly, as P&G looks over the long term, it's pleased with its portfolio. It's pleased with its pipeline. It is positioned to deliver against the growth expectations that it's giving to its shareholders and other key stakeholders. Like all companies, it has its problems. It has issues it needs to work through. But the systematic approach to innovation, building a true growth factory that approaches innovation with the discipline of many other core processes in the organization, has had a real payoff for the company. So we've been talking for long enough now. We're going to pause here to take some questions from the audience. So I know a few of you have sent questions in already, but if you've got other questions, please key them into the question box, and our team based in our headquarters in Lexington, Massachusetts, we'll try to process them as quickly as possible so we can answer a couple of them now. I see that there's already a question or two that's popped in, so I'm just going to take a couple of the questions here, and then I'll ask Dave if he's got anything to build on the answers that I give to the couple of questions here, and then we'll get back into some of the material. So the first question that has come in here is, what is your view that innovation has slowed in recent years? You know, it's interesting. This question comes every few years. People will note that, hey, we haven't had something of the impact of, I don't know, call it the Apple iPad in 18 months or so, and maybe it seems that we're hitting our limits of innovation. I personally have seen almost no signs that innovation is slowing. I look at this through two frames. There's two components to Innosight's business. We provide advice to some of the world's largest companies, and through our investment arm in Singapore, we try to spur entrepreneurialism by investing in startup companies where they're at the stage where sometimes it's just one or two people and an idea. And the amount of energy that I see in both places, inside the large companies who are coming up with increasingly creative ways to fight back against the trends that we saw in the beginning of this discussion, and the small companies that are trying, in some cases, to go get those big companies, in some cases to complement them. The innovation energy that I see all around the world, both in Singapore, the United States, and the time I personally spend in markets like the Philippines and Korea and India and China and Australia, I don't see any signs that innovation is slowing at all. In fact, if there's one thing that I see, it's more and more companies recognize that to succeed over the long term, and in some cases even the short term, they have to make a substantial commitment to innovation. I see that just about everywhere in the globe. So I personally don't see it. There's another question that has come in here. Dave, did you want to add anything there? I don't mean to
oh, no problem. Yeah, I just wanted to add just one comment. You know, when you ask the question, has innovation slowed in recent years, I would ask, you know, what kind of innovation are you talking about? Because I think, again, one of the important points we've been hammering throughout this webinar is that there's more than one type of innovation, and in fact, companies need to manage explicitly more than one type. And in fact, there's many more than one, than two different than two types as well. And so, you know, the question kind of suggests that has the big sort of transformational innovation slowed down, and I think Scott made a case that it has not. But what we also see is that other types of more incremental innovation, we see that, you know, being as strong as ever. And there are also different types of innovation beyond just products or business models. There's process innovations. There's customer experience innovations. There's innovations up and down all of the different elements of a business model. And so when you kind of expand the nature of what you're talking about when you say innovation, you I think have more evidence that it hasn't slowed down.
That's great. Thank you, Dave. And, you know, I think it is true, too. If you look at any industry, industries go through cycles. So you certainly have specific examples of specific companies and specific industries that have had better days and worse days as it comes to innovation. So, you know, certainly you can see pockets of slowing down in particular areas. But I think both Dave and I have seen, and you know, we're very biased too, just given our occupation, but we see lots of innovation energy all around the globe. All right, let me take one more question that's come in, and then I'll turn it back over to Dave to double-click a little bit on one of the key components of the Growth Factory. So a question came in here: how long did it take for P&G to implement their new system? I think this is a really interesting question. You know, P&G, along some dimensions, has been focused on innovation since its inception, more than 125 years ago. But if you look at the specific interventions that were described just a few minutes ago, it was really a concerted effort from 2004 to 2006, and then another concerted effort between 2008 to 2010. And there's another concerted effort that started again in the middle of 2012. So the comment that I would make on that is that a growth factory is rarely a one-and-done sort of investment. It's the sort of thing where you think about trying to create at least the underpinnings of a system, and P&G is a large global company with hundreds of thousands of employees, complicated matrix organization, et cetera. You think about creating the underlying components of a system, and you continue to work as you go through the process. You know, one of the specific things we talk about in the ebook is the need to have what we call a continuous improvement system that is trying to innovate the innovation systems inside an organization. Is what you find whenever you do this, and this has been consistent any time we've worked with a company on implementing something like this. Some things work as you anticipated, other things don't. And as you continue to practice and refine and change, new problems and new opportunities come up. So if you're thinking about doing this kind of effort, you want to understand, number one, it is a serious commitment. It isn't something that you do in a day or a week or a quarter. It's going to take some time to get it right. Number two, it is a continuous process. It isn't something where you just do it once and you're done. It's something where you want to continuously be evaluating it and improving it. P&G is a large, again, organization, so I don't think the pacing has to be exactly like P&G's. And, of course, collectively, we know a lot more about doing this than we did a few years ago, which means those who follow in the footsteps can always go a little bit faster. So with that, we're going to have another pause for questions at the end. So if we didn't get to your question or you've got another question, please feel free to send it in, and we'll, again, try to get as many as we can either through this discussion or we'll try to find ways to answer them offline. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave to talk a little bit more about one of the key components that's an enabler of the Growth Factory. Dave?
Thanks, Scott. So we went through the four main components of the Growth Factory a bit earlier, and there's a lot more detail that we can go through. But we thought we would spend a little more time here on the foundational one, which is what we call the Growth Blueprint. And this is really at the heart of the Growth Factory. And what we've learned over the years is that if you really want to enable innovation to flourish, there's a distinct set of strategic questions that need to be answered to have the right strategic orientation for the factory. And somewhat surprisingly, these are often unanswered in many companies that we encounter. But it's really critical. So I'm just going to go through the different elements of the Growth Blueprint. The first is what we call the growth types. And these are the different types of growth or innovation that you're going to manage separately. Scott described P&G's system for doing that in detail, so I won't go back over that again. But it's important that within those growth types, whether you have 2, 3, 4, or 5, that there be one that corresponds to core business innovation, the more kind of incremental or innovations that Scott described, and at least one that's focused on things that are outside the core that stretch you into new markets and business models that might look quite different than the businesses that you're in today. The second component of the blueprint then is then translating those categories or those types into a set of financial goals. So projecting over time what's the mix across those different types and how they're going to contribute to your top and bottom line in future years. And this is often an exercise that results in the elucidation of what we call a growth gap, because you'll find that your projections, your actual targets for, say, 10 years out, when you map against them the identifiable sources of growth in these different types, especially in your core business, they'll fall short of your actual goals. And so you'll need to then fill that gap with other types of growth that you'll define and manage. The third component of the blueprint is what we call guidelines and boundaries. And this is, again, just a really critical thing to establish and to get leaders aligned around. And the idea here is that if you accept the premise that you need to simultaneously be innovating within your core business, but then also creating new sources of growth that are going to stretch outside of the core business of today, well, the question you have to answer then is how far are we willing to stretch, and what are we not willing to do? What's the nature at a high level of opportunities that are going to be attractive to us? And where are we going to cross a line that is simply going to be unacceptable, and therefore we're going to set a boundary there? And getting clarity around that is a way to really focus your innovation efforts and to prevent a lot of churn and wasted time amongst the teams that are pursuing more transformational types of growth initiatives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Then once you've created that kind of foundation, the next element of the blueprint is what we call strategic opportunity areas. And these are essentially the fishing holes that you're going to go look in to find new sources of growth, explore for new sources of growth. And Scott is going to talk a little bit about that momentarily. And then finally, the last component is what we call the Innovation Master Plan. So across those different types of growth that you've established, how are you going to link that to specific initiatives in your pipeline, and where do you expect those initiatives to realize, to bear fruit, and on what timeline? And having a kind of master plan like that in place enables you to be really deliberate about your resource allocation and to balance resources across those different types of growth in a way that would be impossible if you didn't have that type of picture. We know a lot about not only what needs to be in place, but what are some of the key success factors and warning signs. If I just cover these quickly, on some of the key success factors, you want to ensure that once you've defined those types, that the language is clear and that it cascades through the organization so everybody understands what it is you're trying to do, and importantly, whose job it is to pursue the different types of innovation, because not everybody needs to worry about all of those types of innovation. In fact, it's going to be a minority of your resources and people that are going to be concerned with the more transformational type of activity. So it's important for people, including leaders, to have a common language to talk about talk about those different types. And then it's also important to assess your gaps in your goals, both from a bottom-up and a top-down perspective, and to use a future-back framing as you're thinking about tomorrow's opportunity areas. And Scott will cover that in more detail. Some of the warning signs we see when we're doing a kind of diagnostic around how well set up an organization is to drive sustainable growth for innovation include either not having definitions of their types or ones with significant room for interpretation. It's somewhat surprising, but it's something that's very common. We see it a lot, that a CEO will establish innovation as a strategic priority and even start talking about it publicly. But then if you ask the direct reports of that CEO, well, what exactly do you mean by innovation in this organization, and why? What role is it intended to play? You'll get 20 different answers from 20 different people. So it's very common for this language not to be established or for there to be alignment around it. Also, when you're looking at the growth goals in the organization, it's very common for them to assume that the world is going to remain the same as it's been in the past, and they're derived from an extrapolation of the past into the future, which is often a risky assumption. And the future-back approach that Scott's going to describe in a second is our solution to that. And then finally, it's really important to be pretty clear about what the strategic priorities are. There's often a resistance to the idea that you should set boundaries around innovation, and a sense that even contradicts the nature of what innovation is. But in fact, setting boundaries and being very clear about what those are can be very liberating and enable you to really focus on where you're going to get the most impact. So with that overview, we're going to do another poll of the webinar audience here. And we'll give you a few moments to respond to this poll. The question is, what do you see with respect to the growth blueprint being the greatest obstacle in your organization to creating one? And so we'll give you a few minutes to answer this question, then we'll look at the results.
All right, Dave, we've got the team in Lexington tabulating the results. They're just about to send them to me via the wonders of secondary Skype chat, and as they come in, I will read them out to the group.
Excellent. Great. So I can actually see them up here, Scott. The biggest obstacles, non-existent or inconsistent definitions of growth types, 3%. Growth goals that maintain the status quo or have been derived from assumptions that the future will look like the past, 18%. Lack of clarity in strategic priorities is by far the largest response, almost 40%. A mindset that innovation-driven growth is random, 13%, and all of the above, 26%. It's fairly common to see all of the above as the answer on these blueprint elements, but certainly that lack of clarity in strategic priorities is within those. That's consistent with what we see in the organizations we work with. Anything to add to that, Scott?
Yeah, I think the lack of clarity in strategic priorities, I think, is a really interesting thing as well. We'll hit that a little bit when we talk about the future-back strategy as a way to try to get grounded clarity exactly in those areas. So hold on that one for just a minute.
Great. So then just the last point that I will make here on the growth blueprint is going into a little bit more detail on what we refer to as guidelines and boundaries. And how do you actually do that in practice? What are the steps you can go through? And the way that we think about this is that any type of new growth or innovation opportunity that you'll pursue can be parameterized on a number of different dimensions. So what customer group are you targeting with it? What distribution channel might it use? What do the financials that we require in terms of revenues and margins, what do those look like? What are we going to offer? What are we selling? What geographies? How are we going to make use of our brand? How are we willing to use our existing brands? How we make money? What's the profit formula? What types of partners and suppliers are we going to use? What tactics? How are we going to take things to market? So these are questions you would answer about any particular new growth opportunity, and you might emphasize different questions within this list or add some to the list depending on what type of business you're in. And you first want to identify those dimensions and then have some conversations amongst your leadership team around on each of these dimensions, what would be a clear yes, what would be an it depends, so you might be willing to discuss that particular guideline. And then what's out of bounds? What's a clear no on each of these dimensions? And then once you've had these individual discussions, you can kind of bring the results together and figure out where you had areas of alignment and misalignment, have a group discussion to work out the areas of misalignment, and then summarize that and share it with the organization. And one of the guiding principles around this is that this is a living thing. Obviously, as the world evolves, you're going to be willing to evolve how you've defined your guidelines and boundaries, but so it should be regularly revisited. But in the short to medium term, it can really provide a huge amount of strategic clarity and avoid a lot of waste of time and resources. So I'm going to turn it back over to Scott here to talk about the future-back approach and how that relates to the growth blueprint.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. Just the one thing I would add to what Dave said here, this setting the guidelines and boundaries, we believe, is a really important enabler of the growth factory. And it's the sort of thing that you can do without spending a huge amount of time. We worked with an organization in the Philippines where really within about a 2-hour session with the organization's leadership team, we had a pretty good view of what was in bounds, what was out of bounds, and what was something that the team would consider in certain circumstances. And it really brought a lot of clarity to the organization because people without that just guess a lot. And leadership gets frustrated because they get ideas that aren't consistent with what they're seeking. Teams get frustrated because they end up wasting time looking down holes that aren't going to go anywhere, and so on. So this is something that we strongly encourage people to do, and it's not that difficult a thing to at least get a stake in the ground. So what I'm going to talk about for just a couple minutes, then I'll turn it back over to Dave to give an example of a company a little bit earlier in its journey than Procter Gamble. Then we'll take a couple questions and send you on your way. Is to talk about a technique that we have been increasingly using to try to help people understand what are the real threats, what are the real opportunities, and how do we get good clarity around the strategic intent of the organization. We call this approach a future-back way to create strategy. Let me just show a little graphical way to display how this approach is different from the traditional way that we see people approach strategy. Then I'll walk you through the basics of the process. So traditionally, when people are doing strategy, when they're doing what they might call long-range planning or forecasting or whatever, there is an implicit assumption that tomorrow looks kind of like today, and the day after tomorrow looks kind of like tomorrow. What you end up doing when you use a present-forward approach to strategy implicitly is you end up trying to push your current business model into the future. And if it turns out it does resemble the present, then that's fine. But given the pace of change in the world today, that's a dangerous assumption to make. So the future-back approach is nothing more than essentially putting yourself in the desired future that you want to create and then working backwards to today to try to figure out what you have to do in the near term to make what might appear to be impossible today possible. It's a small shift, but we found people who make that shift and do it with a degree of rigor. They get great clarity about the future strategy of the company and the near-term actions they need to take to really begin to transform the enterprise. So let me just spend another minute walking you through the specific things you need to do to get this right. It starts by a little bit of crystal ball gazing, where you try to ask yourself, what could be? What trends are taking place in and around your industry today? How are the customers and the jobs they're trying to get done or the problems they're trying to solve? How are they potentially going to change? It's something that organizations do a pretty fair amount of naturally. But what you then need to do is the second step. What should be? What is the thing or the future that you want to create for your organization? This is your John F. Kennedy in 1961 moment where Kennedy said, this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth, the so-called moonshot. You want to have a clear sense for an organization of what is the equivalent for you. Now, most of the time when people do this, they come up with completely wild, ridiculous things, and you don't want to do that. Instead, you want something that does have a degree of inspiration to it, but it is credible. It is something that as you look at how technological trends or business trends are taking place, it is something that you could do, though it does push the boundaries a little bit. You then go all the way back to the present. After you said, this is what we want our future to be, you're honest and grounded about today's reality. You understand what your innovation portfolio is. You really nail that gap between the present and the future. You understand your capabilities and what assets you might have that allow you to imagine this future. Then you think about what will have been. You walk back from the future to the present to try to understand the milestones or stepping stones along the way. If you've done this right, you have your Kennedy moment. You've identified a future that's inspiring but looks pretty darn hard. But in the walk back, you begin to understand what you have to do in the near term to make what used to seem impossible at least somewhat plausible. And then what will be? You get really grounded in the last part of this process, and you come up with a detailed action plan and investment to try to begin the journey. It's, again, a relatively straightforward way to think about it, but when these 5 pieces come together, we've seen a number of organizations completely transform the way they think about both the future and the present. It's a very powerful way to get good grounding about opportunity areas, to get more of a sense of threats, and to really figure out what organization you want to create, get alignment in your team, and begin to move forward. So what we're going to now end the webinar with is give you just a couple examples of how we see components of this growth factory in action in Asia. I'll do that. And then Dave will give you a final example of a company that's used some of this thinking as well. So as mentioned, our Asian headquarters are here in Singapore. We have done work in a lot of countries in the region with a lot of great companies in the region. And we see some really interesting things going on. In the upper left part of this page, this is the Bank of the Philippines Islands, BPI, a part of the Ayala group of companies. It's an interesting example of a company that has really invested in the leadership, talent, and culture component of the growth factory, where they have created in-depth training programs to try to cascade a common language around growth, strategy, and innovation that really has transformed the way that organization works. In the upper right, you have the Singtel Innovate Fund and Globe Telecom's Kickstart Ventures. In each case, this is what we would call an idea supply chain mechanism. Singtel Innovate is a pretty large fund, about 100 million Singapore dollars, that Singtel, Asia's largest communications company, has created to try to seed investment in exciting startups in and around its space. This is an opportunity for Singtel, like any company that does this, not only to get a piece of growth going on in its market, but just as importantly to learn about the technologies that are reshaping the telecommunications industry. In the lower left, Medtronic regionally has created what we call a new growth group. In their regional headquarters in Singapore, they have created a team that is focused on business model innovations, finding new ways to bring some of Medtronic's therapies to markets like India, China, and other parts of the region. That's had some pretty big success with innovative models for pacemakers, including the Healthy Heart for All model, which recently won an award from the Edison Group as the most innovative approach in its category. Finally, in the bottom right, an example from India. This is Titan Industries, a member of the Tata Group. It does watches and other things. This is what we would call a Little Bets Lab. The little building you see pictured here is actually an innovation center where people can go. You can see it's quite an interesting building. They can go and kick ideas around and experiment and do different things. So the example that we started with is Procter Gamble. We're going to end with another U.S.-based, although global company. But we just wanted to show you that this is something that's happening in this part of the world as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave, who's going to go through the last little bit here where we talk about another one of the key examples in the ebook. Dave.
Thanks, Scott. So the question then is, how do you get started if you're aspiring to build a full growth factory? And as Scott was describing the story of P&G, that's a story that unfolded over the better part of a decade and is still ongoing in many ways. And just to highlight some ways to get started, I'll talk a little bit about Citigroup, and they've been around for 200 years, so they have quite a history behind them. But they had a bit of a reset point a few years ago. So if you go back to December 2007, Vikram Pandit took over as the CEO after Citi reported some surprisingly disappointing third-quarter earnings results, and of course that was just an early sign of the financial crisis that was about to hit the global economy, with great force in 2008. And the gentleman pictured here is a guy named Don Callahan, who was the Chief Administrative Officer of Citigroup and was working closely with Vikram at the time. And Vikram asked him to meet with their longtime strategic advisors, with a whole range of them, and try to understand, well, what actually is happening here? What's our current situation, strengths and gaps? And one of the main findings was that they lost innovation, in the words of the advisors and Don Callahan, meaning that it was no longer viewed as a core competency of the organization. And if you go back through 200 years of Citi's history, in fact, they were responsible for a lot of historic firsts, for example, the first global foreign exchange network and financing things like the first transatlantic cable and the Panama Canal, that it was no longer viewed as a competency. It was no longer ingrained in the culture. And so Vikram's guidance to Don was very simple. He said, get it back. And that kicked off a set of initiatives that's still playing out today. But Don's comment here is that everything else we were trying to solve was so important, right? So they were managing these just massive crises within their core businesses, but they knew if they didn't start to plant the seeds for that more transformational type of innovation, they wouldn't be able to return Citi to the proper heights. And if I just flip to the next page, I think it's a good story because even in a time of great crisis, when the vast majority of their attention by necessity had to be focused on the core businesses and managing these crises, they were still able to invest just a very modest amount to start on the path towards regaining the more transformational type of innovations as a core competency. And they ended up doing a fairly modest thing in the beginning, which was simply to appoint a chief innovation officer and to set up a group that they called Citi Ventures, which was chartered with partnering with the businesses to explore more disruptive types of transformational opportunities. And if we extrapolate from that, some of the ways that we've seen organizations get started are described on this page. So the first thing we often recommend is that you do an assessment of where you stand today vis-a-vis the different elements of the growth factory that we described. And there's in our ebook and also in other resources that we'll point out in a moment that are available to you. There's a diagnostic that you can use to to assess, where you stand in terms of having these different enablers and how close you are to best practices. So that's the first step in creating out of that a kind of roadmap of where you want to go. The second is, again, something we've hammered several times, which is this idea of establishing a common language or clear definitions of the types of innovation you're going to pursue, the role they play, and the types of growth they're going to support. And it's such an important thing. It sounds like it would be a pretty straightforward and maybe automatic and easy thing to do, but it's just so foundational, and it's so often something that's neglected, but it's critical. Thirdly is just to allocate a few resources to exploring some of the more disruptive and transformational ideas, and it really can be often a person or a handful of people that do that, which is the way that both Citi and P&G got started in that type of growth and innovation. And then finally, how do you expand from there? Once you do that by demonstrating some early wins with that limited set of resources that you've chartered to do this, and then as that builds credibility for different approaches and for builds confidence that you can successfully pursue that type of growth, you then expand out the other elements of your factory from there. Scott, anything to add to that?
I would just call the group's attention to the DMI logo that's in the lower left portion of the page. When P&G was trying to really commit to getting better at particularly the newer types of growth, this is one of the entities they set up. It was called the Disruptive Market Innovation Team. And as Dave said, it's just a handful of people whose job it was essentially to act as an internal consulting group that would work with leaders and project teams that were following more disruptive or transformational approaches. Some of the members of the team were longtime P&G employees. Some of them were people who had had entrepreneurial success outside the organization that would bring fresh thinking to the organization. But it wasn't having hundreds of people do this from the beginning. It was a small team that helped to drive this. Okay, excellent. Well, we recognize that we have hit the hour mark here, but a bunch of great questions have come in. So I want to just hit one or two of them, and then we will send everybody on their way. Appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to listen to the discussion. We've gotten a ton of great questions. We've gotten a lot of great feedback as well. So I wanted to make sure that those of you who have to go, you at least heard us saying thanks. And we'll hit maybe two of the questions that I've seen come in here and then just tell you how to get some more information. So one of the ones that I saw come in a couple times is, what is the business issue or innovation issue you hear most often from clients? And Dave, I'll give my answer, but would be interested in yours as well. What's interesting is one of the things that precipitates a call to us is somebody saying, we don't have any ideas, or our people are not creative enough. That's the thing that the senior leaders perceive as the problem that is stopping innovation from working inside their organization. And we reject that view. Well, we've spent enough time in enough organizations that we've come to the conclusion that most organizations have tons of ideas in them. They might not always see them. They might not always manage them the right way, but the ideas are there. The creative capacity is there too. The challenge is the systems, having the 4 systems we talked about today working in concert to really surface the best ideas, channel that creativity, and lead to massive impact. So we have spent enough time trying to solve this problem without those systems that we recognize, even if you've got the best ideas, even if you bring in the most creative people, inside an organization without those systems, you're not going to get the impact that you're seeking. Dave, I wonder what you see. What's the biggest issue that your clients come to you asking about?
So it's a little bit of a different variation of what you were just describing. One of the most common things that I hear is, particularly from CEOs, is that the challenge is one of around the culture. So they characterize the challenge as wanting to have a culture of innovation, and having creative people would be one element of that. But what they usually mean by that is that they want people to collaborate more. They want people to take more risks. There's a conservatism. They want people to think longer term and not be so focused on the near term. And those are all, I think, valid goals, and it's an accurate observation. But as we think about how do you enable that type of thing, we come back to the system again, because you can't just, for example, tell people to act differently or have leaders role model different behaviors and then expect people to necessarily act differently if you don't think about some of those other system level things like, well, have we adapted our incentives? Have we adapted our career pathways, our HR policies? Do we have the right development programs in place to enable people to do different things? Are we actually resourcing? Are people inhibited from trying different things and thinking longer term because they don't believe there are any resources or funding available to do more outside the box things, and they just have to do it on nights and weekends? So even the cultural diagnosis of what needs to be changed has a system-level solution.
That's a great build. So I'm going to take one last question, and then we'll wrap. Interesting question came in. It was phrased a couple different ways, but the synthesized view of it: if leadership is a key element of this, and by the way it is, do you have any suggestions or techniques to convince top leadership to invest in innovation, take risks, or fund new disruptive ideas? So I've got 3 suggestions for that one. And Dave, if you've got anything else, you can pile on at the end of it. The first thing I'd suggest is see if you can find an influencer, either on the leadership team or perhaps even on the board of directors. As an example, one of the things that really helped at Procter & Gamble is P&G has on its board Scott Cook. Scott Cook was a P&G alumni way back in his career, but his claim to fame is being the founder and now chairman of a U.S. multi-billion-dollar software company called Intuit. So a very credible innovator in his own right. So having that kind of influential voice at the board level really helped P&G maintain commitment even when it encountered challenges. And you're going to encounter plenty of challenges in this. But Scott understood that and could be a real cheerleader for the effort. The second thing I would say is to try to show people the repercussions of not doing things. This is kind of a silly example, but if you want to get an individual to save more, one of the most proven ways to do it is essentially take a picture of them and show them what they'll look like in 30 years, and then explain how much money they'll need in 30 years. When you've got that visual representation of the future self, suddenly you empathize with that at a deeper level and you begin to save more. So you can do the same thing for a company. We did this for a media company once where we said, as we look at the changes taking place in your industry, there's at least a 30% chance that 5 years from now, as you have file sharing and YouTube and Netflix and other things coming, that your business is going to be blown apart. And when people see that, they sometimes lean forward and say, okay, I got to do things differently. The third thing I would say is to find a small way to demonstrate, not necessarily with a moonshot, big bang sort of project, but see if there is a way to demonstrate that following a different approach can have different kinds of impact. And one great way to do this can be to find a problem that's been plaguing the business for years, where you can go and show, if you follow more of a disruptive approach, it has a meaningful impact on the problem. And that's often a great way to get people to spend more. So Dave, any other thoughts, things that you've seen to influence a recalcitrant leadership team?
I can think of maybe just 2 other builds. So certainly finding relevant examples of other companies who are in similar situations, both in terms of ones that are more cautionary tales now, which is what Scott was describing, but also companies that have successfully implemented some of these approaches we're talking about and had good results. So that looking for analogies that are relevant can be helpful. And then the other thing that can sometimes help is to have a conversation about the magnitude of the growth challenge that's being faced, that's informed by some relatively straightforward kind of back of the envelope calculations. Because as I'm sure you all know, evaluation is based on projections of cash flows from now into infinity, and there's usually some expectation, some hope that is factored into the value of a company. And you can back out a kind of what do you have to believe about how much growth you have in your current core businesses in order to justify the valuation of today. and then have a conversation about how how easy it is to believe those things, and then what is really the true magnitude of the gap in terms of how much growth has to be found from new sources that the markets and even internally you can't find today. So giving a sense of that is also a way to get people to focus their attention.
Excellent. Great thoughts, Dave. Well, I appreciate everyone who has stuck with us. We've had about 80% of the attendees who stuck on even for these extra minutes here. I'll answer one final question that came from Vince Tobias, also known as the Innovation Pig. If you want to understand why that is Vince's job title, you can go and check out my blog and look for Innovation Pig. But Vince and a couple others of you have asked whether we will have access to the recording material so that you can review the presentation or share it with other people in your organization. We will, in fact, be posting the webcast on our website, so the material will all be available, and I believe you'll get an email when that happens. So I wanted to thank everybody for spending time with us. You can see the last slide here, some places you can go to get some more information. Certainly, please go check out our website. We publish a lot of materials on this and other topics based on the lessons we've learned in the front line of innovation, working with clients like P&G and Citi and a range of others. You have both of our email addresses here. You have a link to my blog. You've got my Twitter feed. On the left side of the page, you have the ebook, Building a Growth Factory by Harvard Business Review Press, available in EPUB, Kindle, and PDF format through Harvard Business Review Online, Amazon, iBooks, and other places. We also, if you happen to have an Apple iPad, we have created a Building a Growth Factory app that's available only for the iPad. It is freely available, but it has many of the things we talked about today. In addition, it's got some diagnostic tools and some videos that we found to be a great tool to really reinforce some key messages and share with other people on your team. So again, on behalf of Dave, I wanted to thank everyone for spending 73 minutes of their day with us. Hope we answered as many of your questions as possible. Please feel free to contact us with any more, and good luck. Thank you very much.
Thanks.